Good afternoon. My name is Jack Ahern. I am a recently retired professor from the Department of Landscape Architecture. And it's my very great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Kofi Boone. Kofi is a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture in the College of Design at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. Kofi is a Detroit native who received his bachelor's degree and his MLA from the University of Michigan. And this was before he joined the faculty at NC State. Kofi stayed around in Ann Arbor, Michigan after he graduated and worked as a studio leader in a very important nationally known firm, JJR, Johnson, Johnson and Roy in Ann Arbor. Kofi's work lies at the intersection of scholarship, teaching, and service, focusing on two main issues. One is a focus on environmental justice, and the other is on the use of new media to increase community participation in community planning and design. Kofi has published extensively and has received academic and professional awards for his scholarship and community service. Kofi co-directs North Carolina State's Ghana Study Abroad program, one of very few American landscape architecture study abroad programs in Africa. Kofi is a recognized leader in our profession. He currently serves as Vice President for Education at the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and he is on the board of the CORE Network. In 2012, Kofi co-founded the Black Landscape Architects Network. The network's goals are to foster mentorship and to facilitate conversations on the Black diaspora in the context of landscape architecture. The network recently started a newsletter that is available at blacklanetwork@gmail.com. That's blacklanetwork@gmail.com. To prepare this introduction, I asked one of Kofi's colleagues at NC State for a few more personal words, since I don't know Kofi real well. I got some nice words from Rodney Swink, one of the adjunct instructors at NC State. So this is a quote. Kofi has helped us all to broaden our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he has been doing so long before it became the frequent topic of today's conversations. He engages students in meaningful projects that not only expose them to the reality that many face in their communities, but also challenges their assumptions about why and how we design. He elevates us all. I think that quote says it all. This is why we're very pleased to have you with us today, Kofi. It's our honor to have you speak to us. And your talk today, I believe, is called Notes on Resilience. So if I was standing in the room, I would ask everyone to give you a very warm welcome to UMass. So we'll do this virtually and look forward to your talk. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. I definitely appreciate the invitation. And Jack, it was great to have you with us earlier this year before COVID hit, and meet them. Very kind words from Rodney Swink too, who's we refer to as Gentleman Rodney. He's sort of our greatest NC landscape architecture citizen. So that's very kind coming from Rodney. I will now ask permission to share my screen, and we can begin. And my goal is to get through the presentation in about 40 or 45 minutes, allowing some time for questions and discussion. So notes on resilience and resistance, adding resistance because of the spirit of the time. And we'll return to this picture, this cover image, which is of young ladies looking at the Tar River in Princeville. Princeville, the oldest, the first free chartered Black town in the United States, founded as Freedom Hill in 1865, about an hour and a half away from where we are in Raleigh, and a place that we've been working on pretty consistently since Hurricane Matthew, and the inspiration for some of the comments that I will provide in this section. Before we get into it, I wanted to make some acknowledgements. There are some acknowledgements that are familiar. There are some that are close to home. So of course we mourn the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we recognize her great work to the nation in serving on the court. We are, many of us, confused and upset and traumatized by the continued violence against Black people by police forces across the country, most recently with the decision the last 24 hours regarding Breonna Taylor's murder in Louisville. So those are heavy on our hearts right now. And as we talk about resilience, we'll also recognize personal resilience and individual resilience in addition to communities and resources. But with regards to the formal acknowledgements and asking permission to share these words with you from the indigenous people from where I am. On this map, it shows many indigenous populations, and coming to you from the land of the Eno and the Shakori and the Saponi and many others. And I'm also coming to you from the American South, where the issues of race really played out in full force. And we still continue to fight with a lot of those issues today. This is one of the oldest census maps of the United States. It was generated in 1860, and what it maps is enslaved African population by county in the Confederate part of the United States. And so the darkest colors indicate the largest concentrations of enslaved Africans, which you can see along the Mississippi Delta and the river, as well as on the coast in South Carolina, what we now know as the Black Belt. And it also serves as a geology map because many of these plantations were intentionally located on the richest soils. And so there is a connection from the beginning of our country of the exploitation of the land and the exploitation of free labor, which produces in centuries later some of the very difficult and intractable equity issues that we face today in our profession. And I would say to the students and to others that there are organizations out there that are trying to find ways to leverage our design ability and our design thinking and the strengths that we have through organization. And so my good friend Brian Lee at Colocate, based in New Orleans, established the Design Justice Platform, as well as the Designers Protest Action Plan. And so I would direct you to those resources if you feel the need to go beyond what we deal with traditionally in terms of landscape architecture and education. If you would like to contribute your skills and your thinking to issues that make a difference. But we begin this talk really with the idea of resilience. And I would say for all of us, particularly in landscape architecture, when we think about it, we're thinking about it in terms of ecological resilience, the resilience of environmental systems. We're thinking about it in terms of the deployment of infrastructure to mitigate or in fact adapt to rapidly heating and changing climate. So we are often talking about the non-human factors that deal with resilience, but its origins really come from psychology and social science and this ability to recover from trauma, from a shock to the system. And what I'm hoping to share with you today are some thoughts about the social side of this, notes on resilience, and some research that suggests that the stronger that we are as communities, the investments we can make in one another, and the roles that landscape architecture can play in enabling that, the better prepared we are. And so our focus on infrastructure, traditionally defined, still makes sense, but we have the opportunity now to expand and deal with issues of culture, of heritage, and of people. Part of my many hats is serving as Vice President of Education for the Landscape Architecture Foundation. We've kicked off an initiative called the Super Studio, inspired by the principles of the Green New Deal, with the goal of deploying, all of the power of landscape architecture to address pressing social and economic issues that we all face. This is a really interesting article by Chris where he talks about the reference point, the Green New Deal, referencing the New Deal, which happened in a similar economic context in the 20th century. The New Deal was not deployed equitably and fairly. There were disproportionate impacts based on the New Deal. So different communities, Black communities, were not allowed to participate in the GI Bill, were not allowed to participate in public housing programs and other things that we associate with everyone. And so this notion that as we approach the idea of a Green New Deal, how can we leverage resources to adapt to a changing climate, to create jobs, to sequester carbon, and to create opportunities for people, not assuming that that's an automatic fair and just right that will be distributed to all equitably, that we have to be actively engaged in advocating for those who have always been at the end of the line. And, you know, we take inspiration from many people and many figures and look at many efforts that have happened globally that have tried to marry this idea of an ecological and environmental resilience with social cultural resilience. And one of the great figures, Dr. Wangari Maathai, was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, who was the first African woman to get a PhD in forestry from Yale University, serves as a guidepost as she develops the Greenbelt movement. So going back about 40 years, Dr. Maathai graduates from Yale and returns to her home in Kenya and is excited to play an active role in building the ecological and community strength of her home country in Kenya. And she starts to work exclusively with African women there in the field and trying to help them with, you know, forestry techniques. Kenya at that time was extremely deforested, which resulted in all kinds of other environmental issues, flooding, erosion, the loss of farmland, all of that stuff. And so as she's starting to work with these ladies, she's discovering that just the technical deployment of the technology, which is to say, she knows how to read the landscape, she knows how to plant a tree, sustain it, monitor a forest, that when she talked to the ladies there, you know, their main concern really was firewood, was the ability to sustain themselves through open fires and cooking and the loss of that firewood. And that was driving the deforestation in some parts of that particular country. So at that point, she takes a step back and she says, well, how can I link my very strong technical skill set to these local needs? And discovers that the firewood issue was just the tip of an iceberg. It dealt with the difference between men and women and unequal rights between men and women. It dealt with political repression of certain groups in Kenya. It was just a huge web of issues that her, as a forester, trained in forestry, felt like she needed to attack. So she starts to talk about with the women, not just, you know, techniques for reading forests, preserving firewood sources, planting new trees, but really getting into a level of participatory democracy. How do I advocate for the broader human rights and equal rights of women here? How do I help them find a voice to not only advocate in their own interests, but to politically organize and to push against government repression at that time in Kenya? How do I face the legacy of colonialization and the lack of access of Native Kenyans to basic rights like education and land rights and other issues? And so she was a powerful figure beyond just the realm of ecological and environmental work. She was really fully engaged in weaving that technical skill set into the broader issue. But in the end, had incredible positive impacts across our country. So in addition to advocating for those rights, planting 51 million trees, generating 4,000 new business enterprises tied to ecology, mapping on a satellite, seeing the Sahel, that red region of Africa that is grazing the southern edge of the Sahara, retreat and go back in the other direction because of what we now know as the Great Green Wall. So this idea that in some cases you may find as landscape architects, educators, and professionals that when you come into a room and start talking about the needs of trees, of soil, of water, that those don't always align with what communities express on their own. They're related to those core issues, but they don't speak the same language. And so this really represents a little bit of ingenuity in terms of how to leverage both, right? Deal with the ecological and environmental, as well as build the capacities of what people are self-reporting and self-saying about what they want to do. And so one of these models that helps us think about this came out of Superstorm Sandy, which I know you all know extremely well based on where you are regionally. They were trying to figure out why some communities were recovering faster than others. In some cases, it was just basic economics, and there were other factors. But they found that this central comment of social cohesion, how strongly knitted and together and stable a community was, made up of three general components: communities' level of social capital, their level of trust, their level of civic participation, how included or excluded those communities were in terms of equity in living standards and other measures, levels of social mobility, the ability for the least wealthy in those communities to move up in the economic food chain, that those three general areas, when combined, produced an idea of social cohesion. And the higher the social cohesion, the faster those places recovered. And so this starts to become a way of thinking about resilience at the individual level, community scale, overlaid with the environmental. And as landscape architects, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to help us think about enabling those kinds of conditions to occur. Of course, we're not walking into a blank slate, and there are many communities that have been affected by things that are beyond even our lifespan. And so Mindy Fullilove wrote an incredible book called Root Shot, which she talks about the psychological impacts of losing one's home place on a wide array of other social and environmental issues. She focuses on the Hill District in Pittsburgh, as well as the South Bronx, immediately after the work of Moses, freeway construction and demolition of major parts of that community, and discovers that the physical dislocation of those places resulted in long-term psychological trauma that impacted people's ability to function and operate at a great level. And then she focuses more closely on the legacy of African Americans and Black people in America, and shows that there's this serial displacement. Every few decades, there's a major event, in some cases even federally supported and funded, that destabilized and destroyed communities, and that this serial displacement produces a continuous trauma that makes it harder and harder for people to stay in place and build the resources that are required to withstand our work. Slavery, redlining, today gentrification. And it's sort of an acknowledgement that the United States, as much as it's changed, remains an extremely segregated country. In some parts of our country, it's more segregated today than it was in 1960. It is hard for people to believe, but it's true outside of metropolitan areas. And so we don't always live in the same place and have the same connections to resources. And this plays out more substantially in this research from Raj Chetty out of Harvard, where he's talking about social mobility and upward mobility across the country. And just to make it simple, the red areas on this map indicate the areas where the people in the lowest percentile of wealth and income have the lowest chance of getting out of that percentile. And the irony is that the places where you have the least possibility of getting out of poverty are some of our fastest growing cities, particularly in the South, Charlotte and Atlanta. So concurrent with these places that are growing, that are booming, big infrastructure, new communities, new housing, everything that we would think is indicative of overall benefit and growth, are also intractable situations where communities don't have access to education, equal housing, jobs, they're over-policed, and they're suffering environmental challenges. And so this sort of duality is what we live with, and what we're trying to deal with. With regards to landscape architecture, and there are a lot of explanations for why it's not as diverse as we want it to be. We can look at wealth and household income as an indicator of the capacity for people to, say, own property, build wealth from that property, pass that wealth on to the next generation, to, say, go to college, to invest in a business, to help with healthcare, other things. And we see $150,000 worth of difference between white homes and Black homes, in many cases where the actual physical property is exactly the same, just in different demographic locations. So we have these very deeply set differences that have been encoded and reproduced through policy and action that give us, in many ways, an unequal playing field. One of my heroes, and happy to say now one of my friends, Ann Winston Spirn, who really became extremely well known based on her work when she was at Penn, now at MIT. This is a cover article from Landscape Architecture magazine several years ago when the conference was in Philadelphia, in West Philly, where she pioneered a project that was very inspirational to people in my generation and carries forward. And this image shows at least from several years ago, the state of one of the efforts, right, on vacant land, what strategies we can use to sort of strengthen community cohesion in places that are pot-marked with land that people don't think have value. This is one, Zaspen Farms, one of the community gardens that came out of her lifelong work. You know, one of the things I like about this picture is that that gentleman who was in that photo several years ago in the blue shirt is the same gentleman on the right in this picture. the day that we visited that garden, and we showed him the picture of himself in the garden that he was standing in. He had never heard of landscape architecture, but he was Jamaican descent and really loved growing traditional foods that he was used to in the garden. And so it was one of those meta moments of, you know, he was the star, he was the actor, he was the beneficiary, he was sort of the data point of saying that this effort sustained and worked for a long period of time. In short, it was tracing the impacts of Mill Creek. Mill Creek was buried into pipes in a fast growing period of West Philadelphia. And over time, that creek began to reclaim parts of that community. There were massive depressions, sinkholes, entire buildings and sections of streets falling literally back into the creek. And she was working with graduate students to map the impacts of that process on properties. People's foundations were starting to crumble and fall. They weren't even aware that there was a creek underneath their buildings. And so envisioning a new way of reorganizing that community, partially daylighting, but also other references to that creek as a way to focus around ecological issues. And although we all do plans like that, the part that I was really impressed with and that I learned a lot from when I was in the students' shoes in particular was in the early days of geospatial and GIS, really documenting, you know, where the creek was and starting to add data about the lots that were on top of that creek. That was led by graduate students, and also working with elementary schools in this particular community to build curriculum with those local schools to have children learn about this phenomenon and this process, but also learn about, you know, solution strategies, how dealing with stormwater in different ways was important, building rain gardens, you know, developing other things that started to add value. So the broad reach, right? So it could have just been a technical exercise of mapping, but no, when another step of passing that information along and seeding an educational and pedagogical process, it increased the science and math scores of the students by using their own community as a backyard to learn about these particular issues, and resulted in some lasting places and transitions. In our own backyard in North Carolina, we have a similar situation where people have attempted to weave the social, cultural, and ecological components of resilience in their own way. Raleigh is it's got one of the crazier founding stories. It was located because some very wealthy landowners like to drink at this particular spot in North Carolina and just decided to make it the capital. So there's no port, there's no trade routes, there's no nothing. It was literally, you know, a bunch of rich guys. But they took the plan of Philadelphia, the surveyor William Christmas, and turned it 90 degrees and placed it on a ridge between two creeks, to the north, Crabtree Creek, and to the south, Walnut Creek. So Raleigh is literally on a ridge between two creeks, and the city limits until the late 19th century didn't really extend beyond that. Now, of course, Raleigh was founded during slavery, and for a lot of its development was under the Jim Crow era. And there were many African Americans who were not allowed to live within the city limit, but whose lifestyles were dependent upon engagement with the city through markets, through jobs, through trade. And so they self-built as close to the city as they could. That meant building in the creek and in the watershed of Walnut Creek. And one of those communities we'll talk about is Rochester Heights. On the left is an aerial showing downtown Raleigh in the upper left. The red square indicates Walnut Creek, the Walnut Creek wetlands. And you'll see a gray line going horizontally through the picture, that's I-40. And Rochester Heights is between the freeway and the creek. Now, why would anybody in their right mind build within the creek? Well, there is an incredible study of southeastern cities that coined the term racialized topography. They did a survey of over 130 southeastern cities, and other than on the coast, they could use race as a predictor of altitude, which is to say, they could say, you know, with some certainty that inland cities in the south, the higher ground was predominantly white, but not all white, and the low-lying areas was predominantly black. Not just Raleigh, but 100 places around the southeast. A lot of that has to do with the cycle of land ownership and land development. And at the time when African Americans were allowed to buy land, freedmen's land and other land, the land that was made available were in low-lying areas. And so there's this pattern, at least in my region, of low-lying areas and African-American communities. The image on the right shows the floodplain and the floodway of Walnut Creek, and you can see the purple and the blue, substantial areas that are within that floodplain. So, you know, as we look at hurricanes today and storm damage today, it's important to note that this is from 1996. So this is the aftermath of Hurricane Fran in the Rochester Heights neighborhood. Heights, a little bit of ironic term. It technically was on high ground next to the floodplain, but inundated. And the prompt for this that led to action was a similar community that was predominantly white on the Crabtree Creek side, on the north side of town. Same thing happened. City of Raleigh Public Works decided to invest in improving their stormwater infrastructure and remediating at no extra cost to communities in Crabtree Creek. But in Walnut Creek, assessed a special tax, a special fee that was supposed to accumulate into a fund that at some time undetermined would pay for infrastructure improvements in the Black community. So these were happening at the same time. This gentleman on the right is Dr. Norman Camp. He was a chemistry professor at Shaw University, university that was in this particular neighborhood. He was a lifelong resident of this neighborhood. Thought this wasn't right. He's there with his wife in the center, Betty Camp, and with then Dean of the School of Natural Resources here. He's an Episcopalian. He goes to his Episcopal church and organizes a group called Episcopalians for Environmental Justice, and says, hey, we got to work through our network. This isn't right that they're assessing us and they're not assessing this other community. And he makes some really interesting arguments. He talks about how at Raleigh's founding, how little impervious surface there was, how few rooftops, how few roads, how few parking lots. And at the time that these communities settled in these locations, there was lots of pervious surface where water could infiltrate. And then he talks about the role of the freeway, almost serving as a dam. It severed the community, but it also created an impediment, an embankment that prevented water from moving. And the encroachment of impervious surface in the region, that increased runoff is what caused the flooding. And so this community is dealing with a regional issue. It's not their fault that they're flooding. It's actually the fault of regional development. So this is someone who didn't have any training in environmental science or environmental work who starts making this very passionate argument. And so it's successful. The city decides to take that feedback and treat them equally. Through that process, the Episcopalians for Environmental Justice become the partners for environmental justice. And they advocate for more. They partner with, before my time at NC State University, faculty and students there, and develop plans on how to really take advantage of the fact that they're at the highest quality and largest forested wetland closest to downtown, dreaming up ideas of education centers and trails and green jobs associated with it. This is in the early 2000s. Dr. Camp takes this note on the road. And by the time I moved to Raleigh in the 2000s, late 2000s, bond issue passed, and a wetland education center that the partners developed was built. So this is an actual picture of what is now known as the Norman and Betty Camp Wetland Education Center, which sees tens of thousands of visitors every year. It is connected to the wetlands, which received another bond issue to turn it into a park. And so it's become sort of this educational hub that not only provides education, but also is the anchor for action projects. This is St. Ambrose Church. This is Dr. Camp's Episcopal Church putting in a rain garden in their own backyard. This sweat equity with people in the neighborhood. And you'll find that people who are connected to this process are doing the same thing elsewhere. These are our classes last year talking about an additional project, what's now known as the Bailey Drive Gateway, engaging in community engaged strategies to work with neighbors about future additional expansions and extensions. And that student work led to a project that's now being led by Design Workshop on Bailey Street, which is increasing access, increasing stormwater storage, also celebrating community heritage. So that was very important, was not just to hold on to the ecological story, but talk about these champions and these heroes who really talked about how Freedman's Land led to the development of this community, the resistance that led to the resources that created these great benefits that everyone enjoys. This brings up the idea of metrics and measures. And if we're talking about resilience in different ways, sometimes it's about water, sometimes it's about energy, sometimes it's about carbon, but the need to be creative about other metrics and other ways of measuring returns on investments. When we have to work with partners, we have to convince others to persuade people that these are good ways to go to do that. So this comes from a good friend, Fred Brown, who's the CEO of the Forbes Funds out of Pittsburgh, who is trying to develop metrics that combine the UN Sustainable Development Goals with social determinants of health, with the goal of coming up with alternative returns on investment, ways of measuring the impacts of projects. So in this example, if a goal is to eradicate poverty, how does one talk about the benefits of investing in programs like that? Well, in this case, he talks about, $5.10 per $1 invested in establishing basic needs, community stability before doing any kind of action. $5.50, 5 times the rate of for investing in lifelong learning. So engaging high school dropouts and doing other things that really take on other populations. Projects that deal with community renewal, lining with goal number 11, 6 to 1, $6 for everyone for dealing with those kinds of efforts. So it's sometimes easier for us to deal with the valuing of inanimate objects, non-human objects, but he's taking a stand at how do we start to make the economic case to attract investment to deal with that. And of course, the social determinants of health, which this diagram comes from one of the students. We're working with food systems here in North Carolina. We're working with communities that didn't know what landscape architecture had to do with food or with community, and talking about how all of these things on the wheel, from work to housing, education, and transportation, are all important components for dealing with health. And this one from Enterprise Community Partners, which really takes our traditional understanding of adaptation to climate change and climate resilience, really the notion of infrastructure, how much funding you have and knowledge, and expands it to deal with culture, values participation, puts a premium on shared activity, focuses on acknowledging trauma and the harms done to particular communities so that they can begin the healing process, that these other components are becoming more and more common as we talk about them. And this from the Gulf Coast Housing Partnership, which is in New Orleans and on Aretha Cathy Boulevard, a place that has been in the process of reconstruction since Katrina. Some of their metrics are things you would expect. So impacts on vacancy, for example, or occupancy permits. But what they're also tracking is voting. Like over time, does reinvestment in this particular community help people become more politically engaged and more politically aware? Police calls, so the impact on the mass incarceration in the carceral state. Other metrics that are becoming more and more important as we deal with diverse communities. What's important about their work is that they've invested millions of dollars in this area and no one has been displaced since they started. So they've been able to achieve many goals, building new businesses, cultural centers, housing, jobs, green infrastructure, and have not displaced anyone. So it's a very interesting case to look at. We're gonna rush to the end. I'd like to talk about a few more examples from our region. This is in the cover of an article from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, their activity Grounds for Democracy, where they highlighted communities and places and great works of landscape architecture that are tied to our national history. And so this one talks about Princeville, which I mentioned before, was founded as Freedom Hill in 1865, renamed Princeville in 1885 in the floodplain of the Tar River, and is at incredible risk due to climate change. Many of these black and white images show things that are no longer there due to the recurring hurricane and flood damage that this town has dealt with. But in the middle, you can see Mayor Bobby Jones and really the core folks who are still working to preserve this town's legacy and develop in adaptive ways that really work with climate. and we've had a relationship with them since Hurricane Matthew. This was the Princeville Workshop, a multi-day workshop that we held in town after Hurricane Matthew to get a sense of these long-term strategies that the town could use to help it move forward, even in the face of this adversity. What's good about this particular picture, in my opinion, is often when we work on community projects, we get the gatekeepers, we get the elders, we get the folks who have been there long periods of time. Very difficult to get younger generations and younger people involved, but these two young ladies who are in the foreground of this picture, the founders of Fighters for Freedom Hill, now freedom.org, were engaged in this particular workshop, and this became the launching point for them to develop the first nonprofit in Princeville and to engage in really important work. So we were really glad about that. But one of the outcomes of that workshop was that people really don't know the history of this town. And when I talk about Princeville, many people have never heard of it. They may have heard of Eatonville, Florida, home of Zora Neale Hurston. They may have heard of Mound Bayou in Mississippi. These are all other communities that share this similar timeline, but Princeville was first. And so part of this was in their excitement to tell the story. The story was really their greatest asset. We hired local Princeville people to put together a walking tour of Princeville to help people understand why it was important. And we brought a busload of teenagers from our region, the Triangle, to come and experience it. And we started here on the tour. This is about 1.5 miles outside of the center of town. It's the Tar River. It's a spot called Shiloh Landing. And Shiloh Landing was the southernmost navigable point of the Tar River as it came out of Virginia into North Carolina. And so historically, where they're looking is where boats would stop and enslaved Africans would be brought off with a boat to shore and then walk several miles into Tarboro across the river, which is the town's county seat, and sold at auction. And so that was the beginning of this particular story. This is also the part of the Tar River that was responsible for a lot of the town's flooding. So I have teenagers at home. I don't know if you all have teenagers. It's, especially during COVID, hard to keep their attention. But that initial story that layered the cultural and historical with the environmental and ecological got them really excited. And so we spent the remainder of that summer with them, bringing them to the college, exposing them to a lot of design tools that we use. We learned how to model places. Those are models of principal ideas that they generated using SketchUp, generated from a high schooler's point of view what they'd like to see to interpret that trail. And it brings us to this place. So this is the old museum and welcome center in Princeville, repurposed Rosenwald School, which we can talk about in question and answer if you want to know more about the Rosenwald Fund, a very important program in the Southeast. In renovation post-Matthew, but without the exhibits. So it really was in a state of disrepair, and that was an incredible level of frustration from these high schoolers and these teenagers. They really wanted to know more about the town, and there was really nothing there to interpret them. We had the chance to bring that information back to the college. We met a number of faculty in landscape architecture and architecture, and completely by chance, serendipity, a donor called, and a donor who was interested in paying into the design build studio for architecture. And that studio didn't have a project. And one of the students' ideas, one of these kids, was a mobile museum. The idea that until the permanent museum is reopened, a museum that could pop up anywhere, like you could connect it to a truck, drive it somewhere, open it up. It could be the Smithsonian, it could be a university campus, it could be another town, it could be for a festival. And so that sort of offhanded kind of, but very intuitive comment filtered up, and it turned into a real thing. So that summer, in 8 weeks, the architecture design build students designed and built the mobile museum, which exists in Princeville today. It's climate controlled. The first exhibit is inside, which is a photography exhibit of important Princeville citizens. It's been the anchor of several activities. It was to be the centerpiece of this festival in August, which would have been Princeville's first homecoming, organized by Black farmers surrounding Princeville. So it would incorporate a farm tour, a biking trip, and then an actual festival in town, really focused around the museum. Because of COVID, this didn't occur, but it ignited this renewed interest It seems indirect to talk about museums and heritage and history when we're talking about resilience, but it was one of those things where everyone felt like they had a stake, they had a voice, and they were excited to share that story with the rest of the world. We'll close out with last one, recent work with food systems, and where we are in North Carolina, that is really the closest touch point that a lot of people have to the landscape and landscape architecture. We're still a very rural state. So food systems become an opportunity to talk about these multiple components of social, cultural, economic resistance, because as someone works in the land, the consequences aren't buffered. There's nothing preventing people, if something doesn't grow, if something doesn't sell, there's some direct work. And so this diagram comes from an organization that we worked with called GROW, Green Rural Redevelopment Organization in Henderson, as they talked about their model. They have a lot of really interesting things in Henderson. They specialize in what's called micro market farming. So they build cooperatives between multiple farmers who dedicate portions of their land in towns. So that's micro market farm is in what was once a vacant lot. And they collaborate and do specialized sales primarily for hospitals where patients who are admitted due to cardiovascular diseases connected to diet, they provide fresh produce to them. Mobile markets, they have a farm school, they have educational programming, they have a lot of activities that are tied to do that. And so our point of contact was they were contacted by the Good Bowls company. Good Bowls prepared dishes, economically priced, designed to encourage healthy eating, but there was nothing that really dealt with the demographics of their particular community. And also they were gonna be a source for the raw material, the actual produce for how to do that. In order to do that, they needed to scale up. So instead of having scattered sites around town, they needed a concentrated location. The students did a lot of the technical support of thinking about that, working with them collaboratively about the basic systems operating in town, in the community, and where opportunities might be to scale up. One of the very interesting diagrams that students generated talks about 80 acres of vacancy, 4.8 million pounds of food possible if all of it was dedicated to production in ground. So it doesn't include greenhouses or other more intensive forms of agriculture. But that gave an order of magnitude of what was available. But what they found was that because of declining population, because of a lot of issues in town, the county, a lot of city functions were then moving to the county. So schools, or a number of disinvested parks, a number of schools that were closing, and those places presented opportunities to reinvest because a lot of them were built before World War II and traditional town plans where there were very strong community connections, front doors, walkable streets, ingrained in communities. They could be repurposed to deal with food and participation in the food system. That lens led to a different definition of assets. So we do a lot of mapping and inventory work, but the ability to build intellectual capacity, economic connections, open space, support other really key community elements, it drove a different kind of analysis of the land that directed people to the Eaton Johnson School. And so a closed school that had actually an industrial sized kitchen because it used to be a school for elementary schools. So the ability to have a community kitchen and do processing at an upscale way, had courtyards that were open to all kinds of growing, from pollinator gardens to actual crops, to demonstration, to relaxation and meditation, and visuals that helped persuade the town of Henderson to agree to work with GROW. And so they're currently working on plans to repurpose that school as their scaled up operation. So opportunities for students to really support that idea of the melding of social and environmental resilience. The last points are some more current work. This is an article I wrote with Julian Edgemont at Tufts about the issue of land loss. And to this point, we've talked about all the things that are possible in, say, public land or with impacting places that Black and brown people don't own. And what we're discovering now, or at least revealing now, is the importance of ownership, of land control, and how little we do to actually facilitate and deal with that. There are specific eras in American history where land was shared in cooperative ways in Black commons. There are disruptions, as Dr. Fulov lays out in Root Shock, that prevented people from being able to do that. In general, 98% of formerly Black-owned land in rural areas, particularly in the South of the United States, is lost. So only 2% of that land remains in Black ownership. That represents about $1 trillion in wealth. And you speculate on, what that wealth could do if it were able to operate just like other forms of wealth in our country. So land is a very important component. One of my friends and heroes, Justin Garrett Moore, who's the public design director for the city of New York, also founded an organization called Urban Patch in his hometown of Indianapolis. And this is him standing in the neighborhood where his grandfather once lived and operated. And Urban Patch operates like IOB. So it's sort of micro-financed, crowdsourced funding for specific projects that have a strong social mission. Amazing array of projects. This platform, this digital platform, has enabled everything from the development of urban farms and agriculture to cultural projects to the creation of a grocery store and bodega in a community that was previously in a food desert and didn't have access to fresh food, linking to the specific history of that community, and even scaled up internationally. So the Urban Patch model is now being used in Rwanda to build affordable housing through this same format: cooperative, microfinanced, crowdsourced funding, enabling local people to build technological skills, building skills, certifications to build housing pieces. And so it's almost open and ready to work. So this model has recurred and has moved on throughout the world. In closing, again, many hats. One is Landscape Architecture Foundation. And so a lot of what was talked about sounds like it's out of line with the mainstream description of landscape architecture. And when you're going for jobs and you're thinking about, wow, I'd like to think about this kind of stuff, but there are other things that are more important that will make me more attractive to potential employers or potential workers. We've worked really hard at the foundation to provide a platform for people who are thinking in this way, who are thinking in a strong social way. And one of your students is one of our folks. So David Hooper's, amazing proposal, Olmsted Scholar, working with veterans to overcome trauma through ecologically planned gardens. Our graduate winner, Divine, who comes to us from University of British Columbia, but really from Burundi. Her project and her winning proposal was dealing with indigenous strategies grown from her home culture for dealing with big ecological issues in Burundi and that part of Africa. So there's a growing number of people and a growing number of expertise and a growing amount of demand for this merging of the social, the cultural, and the ecological. And I would remind everybody that we have the Super Studio process going on now. We are going until May of 2021. We have 1,000 students currently signed up from 60 different schools, all attacking issues of climate change in their own backyards. And so if you have not taken a look at the Super Studio, we encourage you to take a look at it, because it's another opportunity to meld these issues moving forward. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Kofi, am I on?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really awesome, very inspiring, and obviously very timely for what's going on now. I think your approach is, to me at least, is fresh and novel, bringing a landscape architect's spatial perspective to these issues of environmental justice. connecting the historical origins of them with the social and economic drivers of them, and bringing it right into the contemporary time. Really, really important stuff. And I know that we're all going to be grappling with how we can all incorporate this kind of thinking and these kind of ideas into our landscape architecture curricula. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. You've challenged us and inspired us. And I thank you greatly for the talk. I couldn't be happier with the power and the significance of your message. So thank you very much. Nathan, are you going to be fielding some questions from the participants?
Yes, I can. There were a couple of paper recommendations. So if you want to, the people who asked those questions, if you want to ask it again, please either chat or raise your hand and I'll let you talk directly to Professor Kofi. And also, we want to ask Mariella to discuss the bridge program a little bit if she has time.
I'm gonna just say some words here. Kofi, great, terrific talk. Just a question maybe before, I mean, first it's a question for at the end, but can students right now still register for the Super Studio? Like, could our students do that? I think that's an important question because that sounds a terrific idea to really, embrace that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And yes, it's open. The registration closes in May of 2021. It opened for this fall semester, and like we stated, we've got about 60 schools and 1,000 folks who signed up. The fee, if you're asking, because I know broke college student, I know that life, you don't have to pay until you submit. So if you don't want to pay early, and the fee is per studio, it's not per individual. So when you go to that website and you have questions, you can check it out, but it's on the LAF website. We have a special page for the Super Studio. We've had a webinar, kickoff webinar, that was about a month ago that myself and Billy Fleming and Kate Orff and a number of other people were on there talking about the overall piece and also examples from the past, because there are other studios that have tried this before. So if you go to the website, it should direct you to those resources.
Thank you. Great.
You're welcome. And there was a note that I did see in the chat, a book on redlining, The Color of Law by Rothstein is probably the one, if you have one to read. Very well written, easy to read, really covers a lot of these particular issues. It's a great introduction to that topic. And if people don't know what redlining is, we can talk about that as well.
If people have questions, you can either type it in now into the chat or raise your hands and I can unmute you.
Mark has a question.
Can I just weigh in, Nathan, real quick? So I wanted to make a comment sandwich. So that the comment is just, thank you very much, Kofi, for a fantastic talk. I think you've presented a lot of really inspiring examples and given our students a lot to think about. And the Zube lecture is very multidisciplinary. So we've got folks from the School of Earth and Sustainability attending the talk. So it's fantastic. So the question I wanted to ask was related to your idea about reclaiming the commons and whether you had some specific recommendations about types of organizations like community land trusts or so on that could help to create these sort of alternative economic frameworks. So before you address the question, I also wanted to let you know that Mariella, one of the leaders of the Bridge Scholars Program, just wanted to have a little bit of time to talk about the Bridge Scholars Program. So I just wanted to put that out there, but thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, we do. You know, community land trusts are probably the main vehicle that's available for folks. What's difficult there is just getting into the details, but it's the timing of it. You know, in some cases, people have been looking to those mechanisms in areas that are really going through rapid redevelopment and increasing property values, and encouraging people to contribute or give to a trust in that environment is difficult. But there are many success stories. And so the Schumacher Center probably is the leading national authority on how land trusts could work. The idea of commoning, through micro financing, donations, now enabled by crowdsourcing, is another vehicle. Justin, the last time I talked to him, he was talking a lot about the potential for REITs, real estate investment trusts, as a way to mitigate those forces that are in rapidly developing cities and parts of the country. So there's layers of tools, but what we're learning, at least from our own backyard where we have a number of trusts, is the timing is what's really important in terms of when you begin them and what environment, because sometimes people want to use those as a way to fight, say, displacement or gentrification, and that's tricky sometimes because getting that land control is hard. But the overall issue is that when we talk about landscape architecture in many situations, you know, we're talking about what's possible in public space, what's possible through policy to influence others in their private land and private property. And what we seem to be learning now is that that sort of land loss, that lack of ability to build wealth in place, particularly in Black and brown communities, is critical. And we haven't really gone there yet as a profession in terms of enabling and assisting communities to do that. And so that's sort of the trajectory of that line of thinking.
Would this be a good time for Mariella to speak briefly?
I see another hand raised actually in the crowd from Jordan.
I think you're on mute, Jordan.
I think, Nathan, you'll have to unmute him.
My apologies.
Okay, I think you're.
Great presentation, by the way. I just have one quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed that you guys are doing a lot of community engagement and highlighting community engagement in your presentation.
Mm-hmm. But
how are you incorporating policymakers in environmental justice to influence change in each community?
That's a good question. Maybe it's taking a step back to figure out how we connect with these particular communities. So we only go where we're invited. So part of this is before we work on a project, we have a series of conversations to build a relationship with that local community so that they can tell us what's needed and frame it with us. And I would say if you're a student, you know, that's something to be mindful of is a lot of these challenges go beyond the scope of a semester or even a year or even an academic career. Some of these are really old issues, and it's important when you start to get everybody's expectations out on the table in terms of like what everybody needs out of it. And it's not selfish to say, hey, look, you know, I'm looking for a great project, so, you know, I can put it in my portfolio, or I'm looking for research in a paper. You know, if you say that up front to a community, you know, they have a chance to react to it. Some communities are like, you need to get out of here. You know, if you're not really, you know, concerned about what we're concerned with primarily, then we don't need to be working together. But some folks would say, okay, that's fine, but let us tell you what we need. And so part of it is sort of properly scoping that thing in the beginning so that everybody's expectations are in the same place. With regards to environmental justice, it depends on the community's needs. So in one example, I would say we were working in Durham, North Carolina, which is a community here, along Goose Creek, which was the most polluted creek in Durham, in a Black community, historically Black community. And part of that required us to engage environmental justice, technical expertise, and local environmental justice organizations so that we didn't always just have the usual suspects, so to speak. So whenever you do something that deals with the environment, you're gonna have people who are already like, hey, I like trees, I'm coming to that meeting. You know, hey, I like, you know, fishing, or I like green space, I'm there automatically. It's hard sometimes for people to say, you know, I'm dealing with the challenges of, you know, lead in the soil, or flooding, or other issues. And so working with those local environmental justice professionals helped us identify the stakeholders who needed to be at the table and in the room. I would like to say that everything I showed and that I work on had a policy impact moving forward, but I can't. In some cases, it did. So one success story was working in Raleigh with an historic community around Chavis Park. Our work there uncovered and elevated stories about life in that park that previous to those stories being represented and documented, that park was seen as just sort of a regular neighborhood. What they didn't realize is that it was one of the few safe spaces. Like there's a movie called The Green Book. Green Books were real in terms of books that were produced that talked about how Black folks could navigate the Jim Crow South with safe places where they could stop, hotels, restaurants, other things. This place was actually in that Green Book. And people like Billy Eckstein and Ella Fitzgerald and other people had actually come to this park and done things. So once people kind of understood it had like a regional significance and it was big, it attracted resources. It got historic designation. So from a policy standpoint, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's one of the examples, right, where those changes led to, you know, resources and policy changes that actually connected to community interests. But I just to be frank with you, you know, that's rare. Often it's just setting the table to enable those conversations to happen. It doesn't always happen within the scope of the work, but definitely appreciate the question.
Oh. Hi, everybody. I guess I'll just give a little brief like shout out again. So I'm Mariela. I'm in environmental conservation. I work with the Bridge Committee, and this semester's Bridge Scholar for LARP is Dr. Kofi Boone, which Dr. Kofi, again, I wanted to thank you for the insightful and inspirational talk, and provide, again, the Bridge program a shout out for offering additional spaces for graduate students and our university community to chat with Dr. Boone and learn from the semester's Bridge Scholar. We had the Bridge to Impacts event yesterday, and we had the Bridge to Students earlier today. And these are just other platforms that the Bridge program has used to allow students and other members of our community to come and engage with our scholars that are coming in and bringing in their knowledge, their expertise, and their tool set for how to for what they do. And this is a space that we should all use. I encourage you to be more aware and involved with Bridge too. Again, thank you, Dr. Kofi Boone. And if anybody else has some more questions, please go ahead.
Would it be all right if I ask a question? Frank, how are you doing on time, sir?
We have, well, we're 10 minutes over. I think we could still have until like a couple of minutes, 10 minutes. I mean, I think it's still an interesting topic, and people still, you know, are engaged. So I would say keep the ball rolling at least a little bit.
Okay, yeah, I will ask a question. You know, there's always a cynical part of me that when I look at some kind of landscape architecture project or a planning project going into a community need, there's always a part of me that thinks, oh, if the majority of the residents are renters, as soon as the project becomes successful, it improves the community, they may be asked to leave so somebody else can move in. I mean, has this been an actual problem you faced in your different projects, and what are some strategies to deal with that?
Good question. And it comes up a lot. Like we did a conversation with some students at City College in New York last week, and that was the #1 question. Sort of a fear that by investing in the landscape, that was going to displace residents, and that's real. And actually, the project we're working on now in studio in Raleigh, it's a major question. We had to have a lot of expertise at the table. So I'll give you 3 or 4 kind of thoughts. One is there's a project that we're all watching now called the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. It's a decommissioned bridge. It's going over the Anacostia River. Olin and Rem Koolhaas, OMA's office, won the competition to redesign this bridge as a park. And they knew that it was going to have the effect that you're talking about. So at the same time, Scott Kratz and his group, they worked with LISC, L-I-S-C, to pull together a bunch of partners to develop an equitable development plan that started 10 years before the construction. So why 10 years before construction? Because they know that even the announcement of that project would start land speculation, and that there was a window that was required. And their goal was not to prevent displacement, but to make the community as strong as possible when those private market forces kind of came. And so they focused on entrepreneurship and small business, enterprise development, workforce development, affordable housing, and arts and culture are sort of their pillars. And they have a lot of strategies for construction, during construction, which is interesting in terms of how do you engage communities in the actual construction of this particular thing, and then post. So they've got these windows. And so ULI and a number of other folks are doing a very longitudinal study of how this is operating and how it's working. It is resulting in increased home ownership, increased workforce development, increased small business enterprise development. No one knows if it's going to be enough to mitigate the factors, but their strategy has been interesting, and they're acknowledging that some people are going to be displaced, but they can do a lot more to strengthen communities before that occurs. And they started in such a long time window before it happened that it gives enough room for people to kind of make that happen. So we're watching that one. So that's the first one I would say, is that as a model, that's what a lot of us are looking at. And just as a caveat, that was the plan that was developed for the Atlanta Beltline. It's almost the exact same plan, written by the exact same people, but the Atlanta Beltline didn't use that plan. So the ultimate example of what you're talking about is probably the Atlanta Beltline, where it was the largest public works project in the country for a number of years, but they didn't have the community strengthening work in place before they started that process, and it's displaced almost everybody. So they're trying not to recreate that problem in Washington. The one thing I would say, and I did talk to my students about, is that we have a lot of power, and you have a great person now on your faculty, and Samantha, in mapping and visualizing information. And a lot of communities don't understand the forces that drive displacement. So there are 3 big ones, right? One you identified, which is high rental community, right? So communities that have, say, over 50% rental population, particularly if those landlords are not based in that particular community, they say they're based nationally or regionally or globally, that's like a red flag. It's like, the second one is how much income people are paying for their housing. So if you're paying more than 30% of your household income on housing, any kind of increase in taxes or property values is going to radically impact you, so especially if you're renting. So that's a second sort of data point, right? So more than a third or higher of your annual income on housing. And the third one, unfortunately, is race. That's become sort of a placeholder, and it's wrapped up with class and economics, but generally speaking, particularly in cities, those are the places where after World War II, and the country invested in suburbanization and dispersing the US population, the cities and communities that are near center cities were the places of refuge of Black and brown working people. And then when the reinvestment in cities, that era kind of began in the early 21st century, those were the people that were the most vulnerable to, hey, we're really glad that people want to invest in city centers instead of 10 miles out. We're really glad that people want to walk rather than drive. We're really glad that people want density because we know that that produces a lot of great quality of life benefits that go beyond just the house, right? So you can get enough bodies to support a grocery store or to get city services. So that those are all really good things. But there's this community that was there before that doesn't own that property, that has a limited amount of income, and that has been marginalized because of race. And so that story about houses that have unequal value, built in the same era, only difference one owned by Black people, one owned by white, that's real. So those become the targets for investors, right? Because that's where you're going to get the highest return on investment. So, you want to buy as cheaply as possible with the potential of maximizing the profit. So, those are three things that we look at. The Bay Area, it failed. So I'm going to give this example, but I understand it didn't work. They came up with a gentrification early warning system, where they mapped all of Oakland and San Francisco for its vulnerability to gentrification. So it offered a rubric and a way of understanding how that works, but the policy and the resources weren't in place to resist it. But those factors, and the reason I'm bringing up visualization is when communities understand that, because usually they see it. This comes back to landscape, because what we don't know is that we think that because we put in a really cool park, that's going to make a bunch of developers come in and build buildings right next door. Well, if buildings are coming anywhere in the timetable of your new park, the financial stuff and the organizational stuff happened 3 years ago, right? And developers don't have to share what they're doing until the site plan phase of a project, which means they're getting financing, they're talking to investors, they're doing market analysis. They don't have to share any of that stuff with anybody. The first time a community can see it and interact with it is a site plan, right? So unless it's years later after you built that park, more often than not, those development plans were already going on. There was just no physical evidence that was occurring. So it's not always parallel, right? In terms of build a great park, kick everybody out. Sometimes they were planning that already. And then sometimes there were other things at play. It's a long-winded answer, but just wanted to get that out there.
Thank you very much.
Chris has a question. Chris raised his hands.
1 second. Yeah, his hand disappeared, so I missed that, but I'm gonna unmute. Oh, okay, great.
Thank you. Hi, Kofi. I'm curious if in your experience over the years working in a variety of communities, if you've noticed any patterns of similar cultural and social needs in regards to increasing resiliency based on the landscape typologies they inherit. So, communities centered around river systems versus communities located in upland systems. Because we generally or theoretically know that, all these different components of socio-economic, ecologic systems affect one another. And I'm just curious if you've noticed any specific effects on the social, cultural via different landscape topologies they inhabit.
Really good question. We've been most focused here on low-lying areas within the floodplains of watersheds. And so the bottomlands is sort of the general type, the edges of riparian areas. In terms of resiliency factors, it's, our biggest challenge has been two. With climate change, with increased flooding, increased hurricanes and storm risk, any community in a low-lying area is just going to be at risk without any kind of protection. And in those communities, there's also, for a lot of reasons, a lot of place attachment. where, Princeville as an example, which is, I think people recognize that that place was fraught with risk from its founding, but it being the only available place where you could own property, pass wealth, and have a connection to the land, is at odds with what we know now in terms of climate change. Because, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, their policy with buyouts is, yeah, we'll give you money to relocate to higher ground, but in trade, your old property, you can never build on it again. Can't have any economic activity on those parcels. And so it's sort of, if I had to put it in a nutshell, it's the technical left side of my brain says, yeah, everybody should be relocated to higher ground, but they can't. And we're doing some studies now about the myth of relocation, right? That when you move somewhere, you lose direct access to your social network, to a lot of the informal connections that make community possible. And a lot of these communities where people are relocated to are either outside of their social network, or there's resistance, right, from other communities that say, hey, no, we don't want those people. They even refer to a lot of people displaced by Katrina as Katrina refugees. Right? So there's a lot of social barriers that we are now beginning to visualize and understand that are controlling how people see their opportunities. It's not a guarantee just you're out of harm's way with the hurricane, but you've lost so much in terms of your social resilience. So if there's a typology component, I would say maybe it's policy associated with how we treat floodplains, riparian areas and waterways, at odds with the actual history of how people used adjacent lands. That's a major gap. And it's actually forced us to think about other ways to resource, say, adaptation, meaning rather than relocating completely outside of the community, thinking about the community at a finer grain and discovering those opportunities where safety can occur within the boundaries of that actual community. That's not something that is a niche that's been filled yet. For upland communities, I don't have as clear of a statement, but for low-lying areas, that's kind of where we are.
Kofi, I have another question that kind of relates to the previous question, talking about policies and impact. And so now you said, okay, adaptation, maybe it's one thing that people can still live where they are and get their network. Another strategy that has been, and I think you brought in some examples of tactical, short-term, effective, high impact, low cost means that transform a current state, but maybe lead to policy changes. Could you expand on that too, or?
Sure, should be happy to. Well, Parking Day is for landscape architects, one example. I mean, I'm a little bit critical of it, but the idea of occupying places that were for cars. This is a tangent, and we'll come to it in a second. Occupied by cars for people as a sort of a protest, right? So that juxtaposition of you're expecting to see a car park in a parking space, but you're seeing people enjoying that landscape. Sort of a commentary, particularly in American cities, that were completely reconfigured for cars at the expense of people, and started really as a protest movement in San Francisco. Now, people feed the meter. You get permission from city council to occupy a parking space. It's not as radical as it used to be. But that basic idea of with the materials at hand, low tech, really showing defiance and resistance to this has had an effect, right? So now we can look at the NACTO guidelines for urban streets. We can look at a lot of other policy shifts, particularly for urban streets that, and particularly in COVID, this idea that for public health now, we really need to think about a people first infrastructure in cities. And so some of that energy came from, people kind of ad hoc, with the materials at hand, reclaiming streets in their own way. And now it's kind of become policy. with regards to resilience, on the social side, there've been a lot of things tied to food, as an example. Pop-up markets. This has happened during COVID. I don't know about where you are in Massachusetts, but I know where we are. Pop-up venues where people can get access to fresh produce, where you can do cooking demonstrations, where you can have socially distant gatherings in sort of spaces you're not expecting. So, banks that are closed, our drive-through banks are now being used as sort of areas where this stuff occurs. The parking lots of suburban campuses are being claimed, temporarily for a lot of these particular activities. For the environmental side, Kate, in particular, Kate Orff at SCAPE has done a lot of really interesting stuff using tactical urbanism strategy. She's done things like, people don't know where, I think it's in Lexington, Kentucky, when they were working on the town common park there. Part of that process was using paint to trace the route of the town branch creek in the street and then the sidewalk, as a way to as a visual prop to get people to understand there's like a creek there. There are a number of other activities that people have used in the tactical urban way that could initiate that whole conversation and lead to scaling up to policy. But that side I'm not as aware of right now.
Great. I propose, Jack, I think we should probably come to an end if there are not any burning questions. Jack, what do you think?
Yes, I think we had a great discussion. Obviously, Kofi, you touched a lot of nerves and gave us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your work and the contributions you gave us today, and also the other work that you did with the Bridge Scholar Program to reach out to other students at the university. So I'd like to thank you all very much, and hope to see you all next week. I believe I'm hosting another speaker, Forrester in BC from Texas A&M University will be speaking next week. So
great, one of my
heroes.
heroes. That's great.
He's a good
Thanks,
man.
everybody.
Yeah. Okay, goodbye now.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.